Thanks for joining us as we start the 2024 ISAR Virtual Aeolian Seminar Series. Philippe, Claudine, Andrew Gunn, myself, along with the entire ISAR board, are excited to continue this tradition with a three-part series that we're building on some exciting results from ICAR and elaborating some open questions and direction for future research. First up today, we have Dr. Nicholas Webb. And before I turn it over to Philippe to introduce Nick, here's just some info about the structure of today's webinar. Please keep your microphone off unless called on in the Q&A session. At that point, you're welcome to ask your questions. But feel free to also type questions in the chat at any time. But we are going to wait until the end to read them aloud. During the Q&A, you can also raise your hand to let us know that you'd like to ask a question. This meeting is being recorded and will be shared with the ISAR community. We ask everyone to contribute to creating and maintaining a welcoming and respectful work environment that fosters diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And so now, with that, I'll turn it over to Philippe.
Okay, thank you, Maddie. Welcome, Nick. Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to start again these webinars on Aeolian questions, and so just a few words to introduce Nick. So Nick, you are a scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, based in Las Cruces, New Mexico, at the Jordana Experimental Range, and you've been involved you are working there since 2012, if my notes are correct, and so you are in charge of a national wind erosion research network, and your research is on basic and applied aspects of measuring, modeling rangeland wind erosion and dust emissions, and precisely this is one of the points that we were willing to have as a first seminar, is the interaction between vegetation and Aeolian processes. So we are looking forward to know how these how you can say something about this interaction in the context of rangeland applications. Thank you very much, Nick. And I was about to say the scene is yours, but in fact, the screen is yours would be better, right?
Awesome. Thanks, Philippe. And yeah, thanks, Maddie and Andrew as well for the invitation to talk today. So I guess following Philippe's introduction, I'm going to talk about some things we know and some things we know we don't know about Aeolian process interactions with vegetation. And I'm going to talk about sort of some insights from a range of field projects and some modeling projects that we've been doing at the Jornada. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging my Jornada colleagues who I've listed here, who have made a substantial contribution to the majority of the projects I'll be talking about. Some of these are a little old now, and some of them are quite recent. So I thought I'd kick things off by doing a little background about why we're interested in understanding vegetation interactions sort of at a high level. I'll use that to sort of focus in on some of the interactions that we're particularly interested in here, and some of the challenges associated with measuring and modeling those interactions. And that'll sort of set us up for what's the application space that I think should be pushing us to sort of develop our science in terms of measuring and modeling wind erosion and dust emission processes in vegetated landscapes. So I'll then sort of change track and look at some insights, if you like, from field studies that we've been doing at Jornada, and some modeling studies across Western rangelands, and then sort of finish up. My conclusions are essentially going to be a high-level summary of some selected known knowns and known unknowns about vegetation interactions that I think are globally relevant and hopefully of interest to the group. So I thought I'd start by going back to the 90s with this nice simple diagram by Stephen Wolf and Bill Nickling, which sort of summarizes the three sort of major interactions that we might be interested in with vegetation. So we have physical protection of the soil surface by plants and, of course, other non-erodible roughness elements. Aerodynamic sheltering of the surface, we typically represent this through drag partitioning, where we consider the total shear stress of the wind on the land surface to be partitioned into components acting on the roughness elements and acting on the surface, which initiates and, of course, drives our sediment transport. And then we have interception of sediment transport as containing nutrients, carbon, that kind of thing, which can lead to dune formation. And I guess together, these three effects can have important effects on the structure and function of dryland ecosystems, which is sort of the angle that we've been sort of coming at understanding these processes. So at ICAR last year in Las Cruces here, where I'm located, we heard from a number of speakers around the world doing studies, field studies and modeling studies, looking at different aspects of vegetation interactions with Aeolian processes. This is obviously a really, really big topic spanning sort of paleo-Aeolian environments, which I understand we're going to hear about in our next talk in this seminar series, through to contemporary processes and what might happen in the future. And the interactions cover sort of spatial length scales from individual plants or plant elements through to their patterns on the landscapes and across ecosystems and biomes. It's such a broad topic, I can't cover everything, so I'm going to focus pretty squarely in the middle of this space-time sort of plot, looking at contemporary vegetation interactions at sort of the patch or plot scale through to landscapes and ecosystems. So why do we want to understand these interactions, or sort of beyond our thirst for knowledge of Aeolian systems? There are obviously some pretty practical reasons. A lot of our research, I think, as a community on this topic has been driven by management interests, particularly wind erosion and dust mitigation. That extends to work on sort of mechanical interventions like sand fences that might replicate some of the effects of vegetation, through to looking at different sort of conservation practices that can be applied, particularly in croplands. There's obviously a really nice body of work on vegetation interactions in coastal settings and in dune environments. And there's a large interest in understanding vegetation interactions so that we can better predict patterns of wind erosion and dust emission. That includes sort of dune processes through to assessing perhaps effects of different management practices on wind erosion risk in fields, through to sort of dust forecasting and evaluating dust climate interactions and that kind of thing. So I'd like to sort of kick things off by positing that our understanding of vegetation interactions with Aeolian processes has been quite limited by the scope of these applications, particularly in the context of understanding what's happening at sort of landscape to regional scales in ways that can inform land management. So a lot of the focus of work in this context has really been on croplands rather than rangelands or sort of broader dryland environments. And I think a lot of our modeling applications have had a real focus on understanding how much dust is in the atmosphere as opposed to where is that dust coming from and why is it coming from different locations. So these applications really, I don't think, have triggered a requirement for us to develop models with improved fidelity of vegetation interactions. There have obviously been some important developments, but there are some important limitations, I think, that remain. So if we want to represent vegetation interactions at sort of landscape to regional scales, we typically do that through our wind erosion and dust emission models. We do that by representing the direct protection plants on the surface through their fractional cover and their aerodynamic effects through drag partition schemes. And most commonly, we'll use sort of bulk drag partition schemes that might have inputs of aerodynamic roughness lengths or lateral cover and other properties of the roughness elements on the landscape. Our bulk drag partition schemes are really challenged by what they represent though. So the graph in the top right of the slide here shows data from fantastic wind tunnel study by Shannon Brown, Bill Nickling, and Jack Gillies, and it shows the maximum drag partition for a set of non-staggered roughness elements against staggered roughness elements. And essentially, if we look at either the maximum drag partition over a surface or the average drag partition, we find that for different configurations of roughness elements, often they're the same or very similar. So in reality, we find that the spatial distribution of wind friction velocity on the bed between different configurations of roughness elements is in fact very different. And that's illustrated in the graph on the bottom here. So if we imagine sort of the tail of our distribution on the right-hand side being really important, that's where we might exceed a threshold friction velocity to establish sediment transport. Different configurations of roughness elements can produce very different amounts of excess friction velocity, if you like, above our threshold. So they can result in very different sediment transport and dust emission rates. These aren't captured by our bulk drag partition schemes. So we then have schemes that do attempt to resolve these process interactions with more fidelity. So Greg Oken's drag partition scheme is a good example of that. The albedo model tries to do this as well. Most of the work I'm going to talk about today is going to focus on our applications of Greg Oken's scheme. So all of these schemes have some common limitations though. So for our bulk drag partition schemes, they use parameters that we really don't have a good handle on what the subgrid scale heterogeneity is in our model pixels that we need to represent if we want to get closer to describing the spatial patterns of wind friction velocity at the soil surface, or they use scale-dependent parameters like lateral cover. All of the schemes require some representation of the heterogeneity of the properties of the roughness elements to work really well. So that can often be properties that we don't have a good handle on, we don't have measurements of it at broad scales. An added challenge is that we tend to calibrate our drag partition schemes to wind tunnel data sets. The graph here is from Mike Rolpak and colleagues' paper in '93, showing the drag partition plotted against log of lateral cover. The curves essentially represent what could be applications of the Rolpak drag partition scheme through different data sets. Essentially, if we calibrate our drag partitions to one particular wind tunnel data set, like Marshall's 1971 data set, as opposed to Gillette and Stockton's, we're going to produce a certain drag partition that may or may not represent the reality of what's in the field. And it certainly won't capture the heterogeneity where all the parameters that should be going into our drag partition schemes are in fact changing over space and time. So this sets us up for potentially biasing our drag partition estimates, which will then bias our estimates of sediment transport and dust emission. So a couple of other challenges we have is that many of our regional models still predict sediment transport and dust emission as a function of U star, the sort of above canopy friction velocity, rather than as a function of the friction velocity at the soil surface, which is driving the sediment transport. So this results in both overestimation of sediment transport and some physically implausible responses. And another limitation that we don't talk a lot about is that our dust models are typically not coupled to our land surface models. So the aerodynamic roughness lengths that we use to estimate U star and wind speeds may be quite different to the roughness properties that we're using in our drag partition schemes. And this too can result in some physically sort of implausible patterns of sediment transport and dust emission. So this all sounds a bit grim. What if we want to use our models instead of just to understand how much dust is in the air, but to understand what the dynamics of our source areas are? How do these limitations affect our ability to apply and interpret our models? And what are the implications for understanding patterns of dust emission change in the future if we can't represent the interactions necessarily in a consistent way? If we think about addressing these questions, we might think about what's the application space that should be sort of forcing us to push our science forward. And that's sort of the conditions where any of our models are really going to be challenged. And that's essentially any environment where we have heterogeneous vegetation, variable, so different plant species compositions with different phenology. So certain plants might be producing biomass at different times of the year at a given site. They might have leaves or might not have leaves, all of which will influence the drag partition. Sites that have diverse disturbances which interact to cause different trajectories of vegetation change are all going to challenge our ability to represent the interactions with Aeolian processes. So this pretty much describes any rangelands around the world, which pretty much is encompassed by our dry lands and any of our dust source areas. So I think things, you know, we're really challenged in our ability to represent the vegetation interactions with high fidelity to capture just what are the spatial and temporal patterns of wind erosion and dust emission. And particularly if we want to use this information to inform sort of dust source management. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to look at some insights from some work that we've been doing in the rangelands in the US, some field studies and some modeling studies. This slide attempts to summarize the range of projects that I'm going to talk about. All of the projects are based on leveraging standard vegetation monitoring data sets that have been collected following the monitoring manual for grassland, shrubland and savanna ecosystems, which is illustrated on the left of the slide. So the core methods of interest are the line point intercept method, which lets us estimate the fractional cover of different ground cover elements, including plants by species. The canopy gap intercept method, which enables us to describe the spatial distribution or configuration of plants on a landscape, and the vegetation height method. So together, these let us describe the fractional cover, so the direct surface protection, and the structure of vegetation on landscapes in a way that we can relate to the plant species composition and their change over time. So we apply these standard methods locally in experiments at the Jornada Experimental Range, which we visited on the ICAR field trip last year. And I'm going to talk about some insights from a duneland restoration project we call DIRT, as well as from our National Wind Erosion Research Network site on the Jornada. We apply these standard methods across our wind erosion network sites, so in rangelands, pasture lands and croplands with very different vegetation types, land uses and management. So they're broadly applicable methods. And the methods have also been adopted by a number of federal agencies and research institutions here in the US and globally. So in the US, we currently have over 85,000 locations where these methods have been implemented since 2004. So we use our standard observations to parameterize the Aeolian erosion model, which can then be applied to our large standard monitoring data sets to produce estimates of wind erosion and sediment transport and dust emission, which can be related to the cover composition and structure of vegetation. And the large data sets have also been used to train various machine learning models to produce spatial predictions of plant functional group cover. And I'm going to talk about some patterns that we're seeing from the rangeland analysis platform, which is one of these models. So insights from US rangelands, we're basically talking about the yellow area on the map here. And I'm going to specifically talk about some projects in the Chihuahuan Desert. So that's region 12 in the map on the right, and in the Great Basin, covering sort of the areas 5, 3, and 8 on the map on the right there. And to kick things off, I thought I'd take a look at sort of what are the patterns of vegetation change across the Western rangelands, sort of encompassing our rangeland dust source areas. So for the next few slides, the maps we're looking at are results of Mann-Kendall trend analysis of plant functional group cover from the rangeland analysis platform. And we're working on essentially a decadal analysis to look at how plants have been changing across the West in the last 2 decades. I'll just pick out a couple of things of interest that relate to some of the field and modeling studies I'll be talking about. So first up is that in the Northern Great Basin, so that's, if I can find my mouse, no, I can't, yeah, there we go. So that's across this region here, we've seen an increase in annual forbs and grasses over the last 2 decades. We've simultaneously seen a decrease in perennial foreland grass cover across the west. And really interestingly, from 2001 to 2010, in the northern Chihuahuan Desert, so in the sort of around New Mexico here in the bottom right of these maps, we saw an increase in perennial forbs and grasses in the first decade, and then a decline in perennial forbs and grasses, which was coincident with a general increase in shrub cover in that region. So these vegetation changes are happening in the context of some important climate changes and a mega drought that we're experiencing across the region. So over the last 2 decades, in the northern Great Basin, we've seen an increase in cool season precipitation, which is what drives the plant growth largely in that region. We've also seen a decrease in vapor pressure deficit, so overall better growing conditions in the northern Great Basin. Whereas in the Chihuahuan Desert, we've seen a fairly substantial increase in vapor pressure deficit, which really puts a lot of stress on our grasses and forbs, and essentially gives a competitive advantage to our deeper rooted shrubs. So the vegetation changes we're seeing in these regions are coincident with the spread of some sort of key invasive plant species. So in the Chihuahuan Desert, these changes are associated with the spread of honey mesquite, Prosopis glandulosa, and in the Great Basin with the spread of an exotic annual grass, cheatgrass, and other brome species further across the Great Basin. So we're really interested in understanding how these changes are influenced by land use and management practices, and how in turn they might be influencing patterns of wind erosion and dust emission across landscapes. So to understand these interactions, our starting point was to do some field studies to see if we could measure the responses of sediment transport to vegetation change. And our starting point there was to consider what spatial scales do our measurements represent. When we do field studies, we typically use BS&Es, MWACs, that kind of thing to measure our sediment transport rates. And we have meteorological towers to measure our friction velocities and so forth. And these all essentially represent point measurements in the landscape. They have some directionality and fetch, but they represent a point measurement. In contrast, most of our vegetation indicators represent area measurements, whether that's fractional cover of plants, the canopy gap size distribution and the height over an area, lateral cover, and the drag partition itself is an area-based measurement value. And so we face some real challenges, of course, in comparing our measurements at very different spatial scales. The graph here illustrates, again, from Shannon Brown's wind tunnel data, just what the consequence of these different scales of measurement can be. So here we've calculated horizontal sediment flux using Shannon's measurements of the drag partition, which is area-based, and her measurements of the aerodynamic roughness length from a pitot tube profile in the tunnel, which represents a point measurement. So if you relocate the pitot tube anywhere in the tunnel, you're essentially going to get a different value of the roughness length. If we only measure at one location, our roughness length might be inconsistent with what the drag partition is telling us, and our patterns of sediment transport might be physically implausible. So in this case, we can see both increasing and decreasing patterns of sediment transport with increasing lateral cover at a given wind speed. This kind of funky response is also what we can see due to the inconsistency in our roughness sort of parameters that we're using in land surface models and dust models. They can produce a similar kind of response. So this suggests we really need to ensure that there's consistency in the scale of our measurements, which should make us consider, well, what are the sampling implications of measuring these interactions in the field? And when we do our field studies, are we in fact measuring signal, or are we just measuring noise? So when we established the wind erosion network, we set up to use a pretty intensive sampling design with the hopes that we could resolve some of these issues and produce measurements of sediment transport at a scale that was consistent with our vegetation indicators. So the map on the left, it is a map. It shows the location of our MWAC sediment sampler masts within the Jornadas wind erosion network site. So the scale of this is at the site's 100 by 100 meters. And we use a stratified random sample design to locate 27 MWAC masts within the site. So we randomly locate 3 masts within each grid cell, and each mast has 4 sampler bottles on it. We collect these every 28 days or so, and from that we can calculate the sediment mass fluxes and look at their spatial and temporal variability. So the panel of graphs here shows what that, or illustrates what that spatial and temporal variability is. So we've got sediment fluxes plotted for each of the individual MWAC masts over different periods of time, sort of cumulatively. So first up, we can see that the temporal variance is very large, as we'd expect from the seasonal influence of different wind speeds and our changing vegetation. But we can also see that the spatial variance is very large. So if we selectively place our sediment samplers in the field rather than randomly locating them, and if we only have a few sediment samplers rather than a large number, there's a good chance that we could bias our estimate of sediment transport rate, which is going to influence our interpretation of its responses to the vegetation. So we can look at the effectiveness of this sampling strategy by comparing sediment transport rates across different sites that have different vegetation cover, structure, and management. And we can look at between site comparisons and within site comparisons with different levels of confidence that we're detecting a statistically significant change. So in this case, the box and whisker plots here show between site and within site comparisons for some of our wind erosion network sites, where we want to have 95% confidence in a change detection or 80% confidence, which would be more consistent with what a manager might require to make a decision on the ground. So we can see that with this intensive sampling, we do a pretty good job of detecting changes in sediment transport. Obviously, there won't be changes in every sampling period, but importantly, both the spatial and temporal variances of the transport rates are changing so much at any of these locations over time that we're never able to 100% of the time say with confidence that there was or wasn't a change in the sediment transport rate. So that has real implications for inferring what our sediment transport responses will be to vegetation across landscapes. And these sampling effects also play out if we want to sort of establish models relating sediment transport rates to vegetation cover and structure at sites. So the panel of graphs here shows regression model coefficients, so the slope on the top, the intercept on the bottom, and the significance of the slope in the middle panel, for a negative exponential relationship between measured sediment mass flux and total vegetation cover at the Jornada wind erosion network site. The x-axis is sample size, so that's the number of MWAC masts that we might have out in the field. And we produce this essentially through subsampling our data set. What we find is that at small sample sizes, we find many statistically significant models, but there's no stability in the relationships. The coefficients change, and we don't get stability in our models until we have a very large sample size, so at least 17 or 18 MWAC masts at this particular location. So suggesting that we need that many masts to adequately describe the spatial pattern of sediment transport to relate it to a spatial pattern of or cover of vegetation over the area. So all this suggests that when we use small sample sizes in our field studies, it's often the case that we'll put out 3 or 4 sort of BS&E or MWAC masts. It's very likely that we're making type 1 errors in our statistical analyses, probably type 2 errors as well. It suggests that we really need to use power analyses to inform our sampling in our field studies, and that we then need to go on and adopt more robust sample designs. So we can apply these sampling concepts not just to measuring sediment transport, but also to looking at the drag partition and spatial patterns of wind friction velocity across sites. So in a study we published just last year, we deployed Irwin sensors in the field at our Jornada network site for a period of about 4 months, using the same sort of stratified random sample design that we use for our MWACs. And we measured through different sort of plant phenological stages for the honey mesquite. And the mesquite shrubs are shown by the green splotches on the map on the left there. And we measured essentially through a dormant phase where the plants don't have leaves, through a period of green up and then leaf on. So the dramatic changes in the canopy, if you like, of the shrubs. And we can compare these data with data collected by James King, Jack Gillies, and Bill Nickling at another location on the Jornada in a mesquite-dominated sort of Nebka dune field where we have large dunes with no grass in between the mesquite dunes. And so this tells us something about both how the drag partition is changing over time, as well as the effects of our sampling approaches. So the graph on the right here shows the maximum drag partition plotted against the average drag partition, and our measurements, which we collected in 2020, are essentially in the bottom left of that plot. And they show a large change in the drag partition through different plant phenological stages. So from dormancy through green up and leaf on, essentially the change in the canopy structure had a big effect in reducing the wind friction velocity at the soil surface. And we can see that the drag partition was much larger than for our mesquite Nebka dune field, where we don't have those grasses between the dunes, which is consistent with higher surface friction velocities, larger sediment transport rates, and hence the Nebka formation. So the data also show the effects of sampling. So we used a stratified random sample design, whereas James and colleagues selectively placed their Irwin sensors in the middle of large gaps between dunes. And that strategy had the effect of biasing their samples so that the maximum drag partition was very similar to the average drag partition. So their data set nicely across that sort of one-to-one line. And that's despite the really large heterogeneity in the vegetation at the site. So that's sort of just an interesting side point or illustration of the effect of our sampling approaches here. So the other thing that these data show is the potential effect of an ecological state change on the drag partition. So if our site were to transition from a sort of mesquite invaded site with some grasses to a fully mesquite-dominated site without grasses between the shrubs, there'd be a dramatic change in the drag partition, and sediment transport rates would be potentially much, much larger. So to test the effect of these ecological state transitions, we applied the same sampling concepts to measure sediment transport rates in 3 ecological states of our sandy soils that occur in sort of the northern Chihuahuan Desert. And the graphs here show our measured sediment mass fluxes with their spatial variability at a reference perennial grassland site we call Boer, and that's a photo in the bottom left there. Some of these locations crossed a degradation threshold, transitioning to a shrub-dominated site with Nebka dunes. We call that the dune site. And then some of our sites crossed a restorative threshold following a large rainfall event, and grasses re-established between the mesquite dunes. So we're able to measure essentially through this transition of degradation and recovery, not quite recovery, but restoration. And we essentially see that these state transitions from our grassland to shrubland resulted in sometimes orders of magnitude increases in our sediment transport rates. And that the grass restoration effectively shut down the transport rates to levels that are really consistent with a healthy grassland. So what's important about this is that when we apply drag partition schemes in our models to represent these interactions, we're largely unable to capture either the seasonal changes due to plant phenology or the larger sort of ecological dynamics, because we don't have a way of representing the changes in the properties of the drag partition. We can represent these changes through fractional cover changes, but that doesn't account for the aerodynamic effects of the vegetation. So some take-home points from all this: seasonal changes in drag partitioning and changes due to ecosystem state changes can really have profound effects on sediment transport and dust emission rates. Our point measurements really limit our understanding of what's an inherently spatial process, a spatial interaction, suggesting that we really need more powerful sampling approaches when we do field studies to understand these interactions. And this could really be supported by more long-term monitoring to get a better handle on the temporal dynamics of these interactions. So in the time we've got left, I'm sort of going to jump back to what are the implications for modeling these kinds of processes across landscapes? And a starting point here might be to consider, well, what's the reality of our current dust model applications to understand source dynamics in ways that could inform management? So many of our models still prescribe dust source areas using preferential source functions that effectively biases them to particular locations on the landscapes. If they include a drag partition scheme, then it's typically a bulk drag partition scheme. We might represent variability in the aerodynamic roughness length and fractional cover of vegetation, but we typically aren't able to represent spatial and temporal variability and other parameters that are important for the drag partition. We have that inconsistency with our land surface models. The outcomes of all this are essentially that we must have large model uncertainty because of these conditions. And I think pragmatically, this means that we can't reliably detect change in dust emission responses to ecosystem change using a lot of our wind erosion and dust emission models. So we use development of the Aeolian erosion model, AERO, as a sort of a test bed for addressing the uncertainty in the drag partition parameters and some of the other model parameters, looking to produce a model that we could apply to these standard vegetation monitoring data sets to better understand sort of interactions at different spatial and temporal scales. Our starting point was fortunate that we had these really detailed vegetation data sets available. And to handle the equifinality and uncertainty in our model parameterization, we used a generalized likelihood uncertainty estimation sort of framework for parameterizing AERO. So the GLUE framework essentially enables us to establish prior distributions of model parameters that we know are uncertain. So those are illustrated by the yellow dashed lines in the graphs here on the left. And we selected parameters that were part of the drag partition scheme. So this Greg-Oakins drag partition scheme, the threshold friction velocity equation, and the saltation equation. And we essentially looked at random combinations of parameters, so parameter sets, that would enable us to reproduce our observations of sediment transport rates across a range of our wind erosion network sites with different vegetation cover and structure and temporal dynamics. So this enables us to essentially identify parameter values to which the model is most sensitive, and to establish parameter sets pulling from values in the marginal posterior cumulative distributions, which are the purple lines on the graphs here, which enable us to produce probabilistic estimates of sediment transport and dust emission, where we have confidence that the 90th percentile prediction intervals from our model match those of our observations. So we're explicitly incorporating the uncertainty of the model parameterization into its output. So a useful test of this approach is to look at how AERO represents Aeolian sediment flux responses to vegetation state changes, where we have different changes in sort of the cover and structure of plants across landscapes. That's essentially what we have illustrated here. So we can see that we can get and identify some significant changes in sediment transport rates in response to different kinds of ecological state changes that occur in different soils and landscape settings. So this gives us confidence in our ability to describe the interactions. If we apply bulk drag partition schemes like Rollback's drag partition scheme to these same data, they're unable to resolve these interactions. And essentially, because we can't parameterize the drag partition scheme effectively, any change in sediment transport in those models is just going to be due to a change in the fractional cover of the vegetation rather than its structure. So with this kind of approach, we can apply AERO to understand patterns of change in wind erosion across landscapes. So we can go back to sort of these patterns that are occurring across ecoregions in the West. So the panel of graphs on the right here shows the relationship between invasive species cover and bare soil or bare ground cover. And the coloring of the dots within these graphs is the modeled horizontal sediment flux on a log scale. So we're still developing this analysis, but essentially it shows that in different ecoregions where we have different invasive species, those species are having different effects on sediment transport rates. So some invasive species provide more ground cover that reduces risk of wind erosion, whereas others like mesquite and Chihuahuan desert, which we've got in the top right here, promote more bare ground and larger sediment transport and dust emission. And these interactions are often confounded by patterns of land use and management and other effects of the invasive plants. So if we take a look at the Great Basin, which we've got a map of here, our monitoring data and aero suggest that we have persistent sort of dust hotspots in the southwest and eastern parts, which are more arid and around the Great Salt Lake. But we also see hotspots of wind erosion sort of right across the north in the more humid mesic areas where we have higher plant production, so where we wouldn't typically expect to see wind erosion. And these hotspots are essentially associated with the spread of cheatgrass and its effect of providing a fine fuel load that can increase the frequency and intensity of wildfires. And after wildfire, we're seeing more bare ground. So we know some from field studies that post-fire wind erosion in these landscapes can be a significant driver of dust emissions in the region. The graphs here show results of some logistic regressions between predicted sediment flux, cheatgrass cover, and fire frequency at our monitoring plots. And these are stratified by major land resource areas, so that's what the numbers represent. They're different sort of biogeographic regions of the Great Basin. So essentially what we find is that there's reduced probability of wind erosion with more frequent fires, which is counterintuitive, but explained by the fact that more frequent fires are associated with more cheatgrass cover. But pulses of large wind erosion can follow fire, meaning that the cheatgrass invasion essentially has the effect of accelerating rates of wind erosion and dust emission, despite the fact that its sort of first order effect is to protect the soil surface. So sort of wrapping things up, we found with these model applications that in addition to representing the parameter uncertainty, it's been really sort of beneficial to take an interdisciplinary approach to understanding vegetation interactions. So to give an example, we've adopted state and transition models like the one shown on the top right here to really provide the sort of ecological context for understanding patterns of wind erosion and dust emission on landscapes. And we've also been able to really benefit from our sort of large monitoring data set. So we can use sort of unsupervised classification approaches to identify sort of at-risk plant communities and describe the vegetation characteristics of persistent sort of wind erosion and dust emission hotspots. So some take-home points from this. I think our models really need to be sensitive to vegetation with high fidelity if we're going to use them to understand patterns of wind erosion and dust emission, dust source dynamics in ways that can inform management. Our glue approach is just one approach to doing this, and we've found that it's been very effective and very useful for us to communicate model uncertainty to managers. It's better to know the prediction bounds that you're dealing with rather than to use perhaps a single model parameterization and not know how well that's representing the patterns of processes across landscapes. I think linking Aeolian processes to dryland ecology is needed sort of really to understand our dust source dynamics more comprehensively. And state and transition models are just one way of doing that. So to wrap things up, sort of cherry picked a few known knowns and a few known unknowns that we can touch on. Aeolian sediment transport rates have really large spatial variability, which varies temporally at sites. This makes it really challenging to measure the processes and their interactions with vegetation in the field. So we really need to think, I think, more critically about our field methods, the sampling power of our studies and our measurement scales. Our models that use drag partition schemes are highly uncertain due to their parameterization. our current sort of bulk drag partition schemes really can't describe source dynamics well unless we're able to parameterize them locally. And unfortunately, we don't typically have the information to do that over large landscapes. There is equifinality in both our model parameterization and in our dust source dynamics when we're trying to interpret patterns of dust concentrations or dust optical depth and so forth. So I think we really need to keep an open mind about what the patterns might be to elucidate what the responses are across landscapes. I think it would be fair to say that our current understanding of dust source areas from our dust models is either heavily biased by the use of prescriptive or preferential source functions or by the limitations of the drag partition schemes. Method standardization we've found can really benefit our understanding of patterns and processes across landscapes, and enabled us to sort of use and reuse data for multiple studies. I think overall we have a pretty good handle on patterns of wind erosion in croplands, but much more attention is needed to understand source dynamics in rangeland, so drylands more generally, and ecological models can, I think, help provide more context and insights to these dynamics. Obviously, there are a lot of sort of unknowns about these interactions, starting with field measurements. A good question is, well, what sample size do I need when I'm doing a field study? And we don't know the answer to that unless we do sort of a pilot study. The spatial variance and the temporal variance of our sediment transport rates really vary so much that we need to start thinking more about doing power analyses and assessing critically what we need to measure in the field. This kind of intensive sampling comes with some real challenges. It's expensive and time consuming. We've been implementing these methods with the Wind Erosion Network for almost 10 years now. It's taken its toll, I would say, but we need to keep thinking about how we can measure our processes more effectively. We then, of course, have a range of really open-ended questions about, well, what are the spatial and temporal dynamics of dust sources? I don't think we have a good handle on that. What's the relative susceptibility of land cover types to wind erosion? And how important is aeolian sediment transport to the ecological function of our dryland systems? That sort of leads us to how are trajectories of land use and management influencing these responses, and how might climate change and ecosystem changes determine future patterns of wind erosion and dust emission? I think these are still really open and very interesting questions. So I'll leave it there, and yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for this very nice presentation.
Thank you.
So now we open the questions and answers session. So if you have questions, you can either raise your hand or write your question in the chat, and then we can, Maddie and I can gather similar questions and then ask the speaker. And maybe before anyone, can I see already hands?
I don't see any questions so far, and I don't see any raised hands.
Okay, maybe I can start the questions and wait for until people dare to ask something. So I was very much impressed by this very nice data set that you have in your hands, and over such a wide area and over a long time. So this is very interesting to think and to calibrate models. But when you presented the different measurements, I was thinking that in what you are saying, the fact that these are shrubs or bushes doesn't seem to be so important. Of course, you say that you have a certain environment that changes over time to another environment, but but the approach that you have to describe things seems to be static to me in a sense. So would you have not rangeland but rockland? But I don't know whether this expression exists. But so I guess you could also apply your model with, of course, different values of the parameters probably, but you have big rocks in bit range around with sand in the middle. So would you apply the same stochastic like model? And you also have these questions where to measure flux in between those big rocks. So in the end, what is where is the vegetation in that sense?
Where's the vegetation in the model, or is that what you're?
Yes, in the values, because you could apply the model with something which is not vegetation, but let's say
Sure.
big rocks, or do you have something very specific to the fact that you have a shrub of vegetation which has particular mechanical properties which are different from solid obstacles?
Yeah. So I guess with aero, we're representing the vegetation through its fractional cover and then through the canopy gap size distribution, so the spacing of the elements, it doesn't have to be vegetation. It could be rocks, fences, whatever, and their height. And then we're modifying the effect of their different sort of drag coefficients, if you like, through a couple of parameters in the drag partition scheme that describe the amount of reduction in friction velocity immediately behind the plant and then its recovery downwind. So we're not representing at the moment effects like the speed up of the wind around plants and that kind of thing. But so we essentially, from the monitoring data sets, just take the structural information about the plants. And then because we don't know the individual drag coefficients and so forth of plants, we represent the uncertainty of that with our glue parameter sets. So if you wanted to specifically represent one vegetation type and compare it to another, if you had the data, you could develop a parameterization for each of those and then compare them. The reality is that the vegetation across these landscapes is just so diverse, we've got no chance of doing that. So it's better that we represent the range of conditions constrained by our observations of sediment transport rates.
Thank you.
Nick, we have a question from James. It says, thanks for the great overview. Could you comment on how these simulations or state changes could be extrapolated or explicitly simulated at longer time periods, like those associated with larger landscape changes? And James, feel free to unmute as well if you'd like to add to that.
Yep, thanks, James. So on how these could be extrapolated to longer time periods, so I guess the DERP study that I talked about, where we looked at sort of 3 state changes, where it's obviously hard to measure these in the field, that's effectively a space for time sort of thing. So if we're able to build our observations of transport rates in different ecological states across landscapes, that gives us a sense of what's happened sort of over the last 100, 200, 300 years in terms of the ecological dynamics. Because it's so hard to measure those patterns, we're really relying on aero to get a handle on that. So we're essentially classifying the monitoring data sets to ecological sites, which is sort of soil geomorphic units, and within that keying the plots to different ecological states based on their vegetation composition. And then from there, we can sort of pass out how sediment transport rates are changing with state changes. There have been some efforts to use the monitoring data sets to develop sort of statistical state and transition models to look at the probability of state transitions across landscapes. We haven't connected with that yet, but I think that's an interesting direction that we could go to think about sort of what are the chances of us moving into a particular ecological state, particularly as the climate's changing and the ecosystems are continuing to change.
Nick, I have a question. Let me make sure I'm not jumping in front of anyone with their hand up. obviously, when you're collecting field data of this type, there's many different variables that you have to consider, and not just in thinking both on a seasonal scale or a longer temporal scale. How well do you feel that we can tease out differences, and not just vegetation, but obviously the vegetation is affected by climate, and so changes in moisture variability. And so I know you just showed like a piece of so much rich data that has been collected at these monitoring sites, but could you just talk about that as well, since there's got to be feedback going on between changes in the climate, changes in precipitation, and the vegetation and the transport all happening at the same time, and other things that I'm not mentioning.
So is the core of your question, how do we tease those apart, those interactions?
Well, I mean, obviously there's different instruments to measure different things, but how well do you feel like from this data that you can confidently tease that out?
The temporal dynamics are difficult with the monitoring data sets that we have that are collected regionally, because they're typically collected once a year. So, and that has also influenced the rangeland analysis platform. So those spatial predictions that I talked about first with the trend analysis. So they essentially represent annual estimates where sampling is typically done in the summer or whatever the growing season is. So we can look at responses to drought and that kind of thing, but the data sets on our public rangelands have only been collected since 2011. So that sort of duration isn't necessarily long enough to get a good handle on sort of long-term drought impacts and that kind of thing. So we're kind of just right on the edge of getting into what's the extent of things that we can look at. Using the remote sensing products has been really useful for looking at sort of the climate interactions over the last 2 decades. And then the monitoring data have been really useful for looking at sort of implications for ecological state changes, but sort of teasing apart more of the temporal dynamics is difficult. Yep.
Thanks. We have a question from, looks like Sylvian, and feel free to unmute if you'd like to. Thank you for the talk. If one measures sand flux or shear velocity in the field, which are very important vegetation parameters that should be reported? Size, density.
Yeah, I've drunk the Kool-Aid, so I'm really biased towards the methods we're using. So I think the structure of the vegetation is critical. So the canopy gap size, the canopy gap intercept method, and the height method that are in the monitoring manual are very useful for that. We've found that, and of course, using a line point intercept method to get at the fractional cover. I understand measuring properties like lateral cover is quite difficult and time consuming. In any of our field measurements, it's difficult to reach a good level of standardization with many sort of different approaches. So that's why we've sort of focused our efforts on the methods that I talked about today. But ultimately, if you know the spatial configuration and height of the roughness elements, you can get a pretty good handle on the drag partition. So that's sort of why we've focused on those.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Next, we have one from Fred Fox. As surface vegetation coverage becomes more uniform and closely spaced, do these methods coverage two results from methods using bulk drag partitioning?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure. Sorry, Fred, if I'm messing it up, if I'm not following you. Do these methods converge to results from methods using bulk drag partitioning? And Nick, you should be able to see the questions too. This one comes from the Q&A. And Fred, feel free to also unmute and ask your question better than I am.
Yeah, I think they do, Fred, because your gap, both the fractional cover would increase and the gap sizes would decrease, meaning that you would get you'd approach skimming flow essentially, and you would end up with declining until you have effectively no friction velocity at the soil surface because it's all in the canopy. So, yeah. Did you want me to answer Anton's question about crusts?
Yeah, it looks like it's that question is a little related as well to let's see here, to Larry's possibly, but just differences in like rock, loose soil, crusted surfaces, and emission potential. But yeah, go ahead and let's move on to Anton's, and we can Larry, feel free to unmute and ask more if we haven't covered your question as well.
Yep. So yeah, really good question. And I mean, if we could represent the effects of physical and biological crusting and changing supply of loose erodible material, that would be amazing. I think for broad landscapes like we're looking at, we're just nowhere near that. With our line point intercept method that we use at the wind erosion network sites, we record these properties, but it's difficult to relate them physically to the dust emission processes in ways that are generalizable across these really broad landscapes. So essentially the way that we're handling crusts and supply limitation at the moment is to pack the effects of those into the uncertainty of the glue parameters. So by representing a different sort of constant in our sediment transport equation, a range of plastic pressures in our dust emission scheme, that kind of thing, and then calibrating our parameter sets, if you like, to field measurements in settings which do have a range of physical and biological crust cover, we're essentially incorporating the crust and supply limitation effects into the parameterization. So it's, rather than handling it explicitly by knowing exactly what the sediment transport response to changing crust cover is, we pack it into the uncertainty and sort of general parameterization of error.
Great.
And just one thing to pick up on that would be, so the photo on the screen is sort of post-wildfire in the Northern Great Basin. Fire obviously has a big effect on dynamic soil properties. So one thing that we're looking at is, can we produce a specific parameterization to represent sort of post-fire conditions? A question would then be, will our parameter sets be any different to the broader ones that we've sort of captured already? So I think using this kind of sort of uncertainty approach opens some interesting pathways to examining how we represent some of these more complex interactions.
Thanks, Nick. Maybe we'll just wrap up with the last question that we have from Hossam. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Ecological dynamics in rangeland is usually driven by change in water availability, for example, changes in precipitation patterns or runoff patterns. But the water conditions in the surface also affect Aeolian processes and dust emissions. How do you consider this in your research?
Yeah, I guess in the way that we're applying aero in the modeling context, we're not. We can include moisture effect, but we don't, simply because we don't have good local surface observations of moisture at our monitoring plots. At our some of our wind erosion network sites and our finer scale studies, we do measure moisture and its dynamics, and we are attempting to relate that to the patterns that we see at the site scale. But in the modeling context, we're not at the moment. So yeah, so I think the way that we're interpreting our model estimates based on the monitoring data sets is essentially as a snapshot of the potential sediment transport and dust emission, rather than what it truly was at a given location, which would require knowledge of the moisture and its effects.
Well, Well, thank you, Nick.
Okay.
And thanks for everyone who tuned in. Nick, do you mind clicking to the last slide as we do a plug for our next talk as we wrap up? But yeah, everyone, again, join me in thanking Nick for a wonderful presentation today. Our next talk in the series is Dr. Xiaoping Yang on Aeolian deposits and paleoclimates. The talk is going to be April 15th at 3 p.m. Beijing time. We will soon have the additional information and Zoom registration on our website, which is that link right there. If you also last week, the newly revived ISAR newsletter went out. If you didn't receive it, or you have any questions about it, or your membership status, feel free to reach us at admin@aeolianresearch.com. That email address is also available on the website. So if you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach us there. So thank you all again, and I hope to see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.